Då är du hjärtligt välkommen, du som är tittare och lyssnare på det här programmet, till en ny vecka med BibelPodden. Och jag som sitter i studion i Stockaryd heter Per Ewert, och på länk har vi
Jonas Dagson, jag sitter i Göteborg.
Minsann, en del tycker att du kanske är insnöad i vanliga fall, men nu är du insnöad där och kommer inte till studion idag.
Tyvärr inte.
Men du, kan du uppdatera oss på nu när vi är på det nya året, hur det går med dina bibelprojekt, och du har projekt med USA och så vidare?
Ja, jag sitter och gör en amerikansk version av det studiematerial som finns i steg för steg studiebibel. Och den första är att vi ska göra en bok på Nya testamentet, och man har nu satt ett releasedatum i USA till den 6 oktober, så nu får vi pinna på för att få det färdigt.
Ja, men det är ju fint att vi kan samtala så här lite via länk, även du som sitter i Sverige. Men i det här programmet, BibelPodden, då försöker vi ju dels informera och berätta om information om Bibeln, kommer vi göra i dagens huvudintervju. Men vi försöker också hjälpa människor med bibelläsningen. Ungefär som när Filippus kliver upp till hovmannen i vagnen och frågar om han förstår vad han läser. Och då har du tänkt att vi skulle kunna guida tittarna och lyssnarna lite grann på det här.
Ja, alltså jag tänker så här att en av problemen som man har med bibelläsning, det är ju att man öppnar Bibeln och läser, men man har egentligen inte alltid någon idé. Vad är det jag ska titta efter? Vad är det jag ska leta efter när jag läser en bibeltext? Och jag brukar tänka att det finns 5 saker, så ska jag göra, som man ska ha med sig i sinnet liksom när man läser. Va? Och det första vi tittar på, det är ju genre. Vad är det för typ av text som vi har framför oss? Va? Och sen ska vi titta på strukturerna. Hur har författaren liksom strukturerat sitt material? Och sen brukar jag tänka att man ska skilja på litterär struktur, det vill säga hur boken är uppbyggd. Och sen grammatisk struktur, och det är när man börjar titta på enskilda verser. Hur hänger saker och ting ihop i ord och uttryck så. Och sen det fjärde som man tittar på, det är att försöka förstå ord eller termer. Och skillnaden på det är att ett ord kan betyda många saker, men en term, den betyder en specifik sak i sitt sammanhang då. Så vad betyder det här ordet i det här sammanhanget? Och sen tycker jag det 5:e man ska titta efter, det är atmosfär. Det vill säga Bibeln är liksom inte en klinisk lärobok, utan den handlar om verkliga människor i verkliga situationer. Och då måste man försöka förstå hur skulle galaterna ha reagerat när Paulus skriver ni dåraktiga galater. Hade man liksom hukat sig, va? Och hur skulle det ha känts om jag hade varit med i ett semane när tempelvakten kommer eller någonting, att utan att vara spekulativ ändå försöka förstå någonting av det som sker på ett emotionellt plan.
Men ska vi börja då och titta på just det här med genre idag då? Vad innehåller Bibeln för olika genrer, om vi gör en liten introduktion?
Ja, men om man börjar med att säga genre, det betyder ju typ av text. Vad är det för slags text? Va? Det är ungefär som förr när alla läste tidningar. Så innehöll ju tidningen, det var en ledare, det var uttryckta åsikter, vi hade nyheter, de sa så. Vi hade kåserier, vi hade sporten. Jag brukar tänka så att om det stod domarskandal över en artikel på sportsidan, då var det någon kille i svart och vitrandig tröja som har blåst fel i en visselpipa. Va? Men om samma rubrik stod på nyhetssidan, då kunde det ha varit liksom rättsväsendet som havererat därför att en domare i en domstol inte hade gjort rätt. Och då handlar det om att jag förstod att orden har lite olika betydelser beroende på vilken genre de har. Och i Bibeln innehåller många genrer. Den kanske vanligaste, det är ju liksom den berättande texten. Vi har ju de 17 berättande böckerna, de historiska böckerna i Gamla testamentet. Vi har evangelierna och apostlärningarna i Nya testamentet. Och berättande texten har som huvudsakligt syfte att berätta vad som har hänt. Den berättar inte hur vi ska göra, utan vad det är som har hänt bakåt. Va? Sen finns det, evangelierna är lite speciella, för det är en slags egen genre där man varvar olika saker. Men vi har ju i Gamla testamentet lagtexter till exempel. Då blir det ju juridik, då ska vi förstå att nu ska man spalta upp saker och det här är det som gäller. Sen har vi ju den poetiska litteraturen. Dels så talar vi om vishetslitteraturen som Jobb, Predikaren, Orsaksboken förstås, som försöker liksom förmedla vardagsinformation på något sätt om hur livet funtar sig. Vi har den lyriska diktningen som Psaltaren, Höga visan, kanske klagovisorna. Och där använder man ju ett helt annat språk. Där är det stilfigurer Och där är det liksom parallellism, liksom den hebreiska formen av poetiskt språk och så. Och den kan man inte förstå på samma sätt som de historiska böckerna. Va? Och sen har vi de undervisande breven naturligtvis. Vi har ju predikningar, vi har profetier och speciellt den typen av text vi kallar för apokalyptisk text. Hesekiel, Daniel, Sakarja, uppenbarelseboken, men kanske egentligen också Matteus 24-25 och några andra sådana här texter och här kommer ju en annan form av bildspråk in. Här är det vilddjur och det är alla möjliga saker som vi också behöver avkoda. Va? Och då är det viktigt när jag läser att jag ställer mig själv frågan så här, vad är det här för slags text? Man kan ju ta en sån tydlig skillnad. Att tittar jag på ordspråksboken så är ju ordspråk en beskrivning av vad som vanligen är sant. Men när jag läser den undervisande texten av Paulus eller så i Romarbrevet, då är det vad som alltid är sant. Det är liksom en evig sanning. Och då måste jag ju skilja på de här genrerna för att jag inte ska övertolka den ena eller undertolka den andra. Va? Så det första rådet som jag säger, det är liksom, titta vad det är för genre.
Ja.
Räcker det så?
Det är ett bra läsråd. Och Bibeln är ju fenomenal i att genom de här olika genrerna, olika typerna av texterna ändå förmedla en övergripande berättelse. Och i dagens program så ska vi försöka jämföra Bibeln med en annan väldigt känd stor text för en stor världsreligion, nämligen islam, som gör anspråk på att vi har den perfekta texten som är nedfallen från himlen, från Allah. Och till vår hjälp så har vi en disputerad islamolog som också är en bibeltroende kristen som heter Andy Bannister. Och honom har jag pratat med. Så att jag tänker att vi kopplar över till den intervjun och så återkopplar vi efter den, Jonas.
Det låter bra.
So our favorite guest of the day is all the way from the United Kingdom, Andy Bannister. Welcome to the Bible podcast.
It's great to be with you, Per. Thank you for having me onto your pod.
Yes, indeed. And you have been to Sweden and Scandinavia several times before. On what kind of occasions?
Well, two reasons. Firstly, personal. So my wife is part Swedish, part Norwegian. We have family in Stockholm. So I've been over many times. And then over the years, done a lot with particularly student events over there. So there's an organisation called IFES, the International Federation of Evangelical Students. So I've done a lot for them in Norway. And then in Sweden, of course, dear old Stefan Gustafsson, who seems to be known all over Sweden, very well-known Christian communicator. Stefan and I have been friends for years. So I often have come over and done stuff with him. And in fact, that's where you and I last met in person back in, was it November?
November, like and we tried our best to do this interview back then at the conference Mission Kingdom of God. But didn't actually make it. But now the internet and the modern technology helps us.
The internet. Absolutely, and it's good because you do in person. I look shorter in person. I look 5'8" in person, but on the video screen I could be taller.
Okay, wonderful. So I thought I'd just catch back to what you do in your general work. You work for an organisation called SOLAS. Tell us about it.
I do. So SOLAS, that's the Scots Gaelic word for light. And we were started in about 16 years ago by a Scottish Presbyterian pastor who really had a vision to get the message of Jesus outside the four walls of the churches. So that's partly what we do. We do a lot of work on university campuses and in schools with students, and also helping churches put on outreach events in cafes and pubs and neutral spaces. So we love sharing the message of Jesus, helping people see that Christian faith makes good sense and is compelling. And the other half of what we do is we love teaching and training and equipping Christians to feel confident sharing their faith with their friends, neighbours, colleagues, classmates. So that's really it. Half our time talking to Christians, half our time talking to non-Christians.
And this is interesting, this being the Bible podcast. I saw you posting on social media just yesterday when we record this program that Bible sales seem to be reaching a historical high in the United Kingdom. Tell us about it.
Yeah, they are. This is what excites me about that post on Facebook, right, is in the last week, we've had two newspapers, one a more left-wing newspaper, more a right-wing newspaper, report the same data. And they were both quite positive about this. They were secular newspapers. picking up on the fact, yes, Bible sales are through the roof, especially we think among young people, as far as the data can be told, historic high. And this taps into some broader things going on. I don't know how it is in Sweden right now, but in the UK, for some time, there's been this movement that's come to be termed the quiet revival. Not sure the word revival is necessarily the right word, but certainly I would say awakening. But we're seeing far more interest in spiritual things, again, especially among those aged under 30. So when I do university events now, you see far more students coming and exploring. A whole number of reasons for that, but I think the Bible piece taps into that. And what interests me, and I think that newspaper article I posted yesterday, had an interview with a bookseller who said, a quote from a bookseller, is that people are coming in cold. They're not coming in going, well, I've studied the Bible, I've thought about it, I want a new copy. In many cases, they're coming in and go, I've never read the Bible, maybe I ought to. Where do I start? Which is both an amazing opportunity and also a challenge, right? Because I think often in churches, we can assume we're dealing with people who at least have some knowledge of Scripture. You've got this new cultural moment where there's more openness, but among people who have no idea what the Bible is or where to begin. And that's a great opportunity, but also a challenge, right? Because somebody buys a Bible randomly, goes home and opens it, and the first thing they land on is like Lamentations. They're going to struggle slightly. So part of our job, I think, as Christian communicators is to help people encounter the Bible. How do you do it? Where's a good place to start? What's a good way to engage? How do you think about what you find there?
So we understand your working is about communicating the Christian faith, talking about the Bible and so on. We have read your books, The Atheist Who Didn't Exist, How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot. We get the impression that this is what you work with, and then we suddenly look into your academic work and realize that this is like a different career. What did you write your PhD dissertation about and why?
Well, it's always a danger to ask somebody what they wrote their PhD on because they think it's really interesting and it may not be. So that's a very dangerous question. But in a nutshell, my PhD was looking at how the Koran, the scripture of Islam, was put together. To understand why, let me tell you a very quick bit of backstory. In the late 1990s, I was working as a youth worker for some churches in London. I had a secular career first, then I got into full-time Christian ministry. And a friend came to our church, did a seminar on reaching Muslims, and explained how every Sunday he was going up to London and doing street evangelism, preaching to Muslims. And he said, why don't you come and see what we do? So I trotted along with him, not realizing his definition of come and see what we do was try preaching. So he forced me up onto a ladder and had me preach on my first Sunday. And the Muslims tore me to pieces because they knew how to deal with Christians and I knew nothing. But I got kind of hooked. And so I went home and spent the next 2 weeks kind of reading to find answers to their questions, many of which were about the Bible. And I went back the following week and again was humiliated, but a little less humiliated. And for the next 3 to 4 months, I would go to London every weekend and preach to Muslims. And I kind of fell in love with engaging Muslims, trying to engage their questions. That was where I first discovered apologetics. And through that, God opened my eyes to the fact that I had an academic side to me. I was 28 at this point. I had not been to university. I didn't come from a family where anyone had been to university. So it was a bit of an eye-opening thing, really. And so I went off to Bible college. I found a seminary that actually did Islamic studies as well as Christian theology. I was a former missionary, ran that module. And then I got my degree, did quite well, and kind of then kept going and ended up doing a PhD. It's, as I say, looking at how the Quran was put together and having fun. My first love years ago before theology had been computer science. So I actually ended up using early versions of machine learning to kind of look at the structure in the Quran and stuff. So it combined everything: theology, history, gently deconstructing Islam, and messing around with computers for 7 years.
Mm-hmm. So life can be surprising sometimes, and career choices can be surprising. But...
It can be, can't it? But it did teach me I did not want to be an academic. So I went into the PhD thinking maybe I would go in and come out and be an academic. And it made me realize, no, I can't do it. I like communicating with ordinary people. I like taking big ideas and helping people understand them.
Yeah, but you do have the knowledge and that you do have the experience of this discussion between Christians and Muslims, comparisons between the Bible and the Quran. We're used to having the critical discussions about the Bible in different ways. How do Muslims in general treat discussions, serious critical discussions about the Quran?
Well, there's many things I could say there. The first thing is there has not been a history generally within Islam of Muslims doing that. So just take one topic in particular. Take the issue of how our Bible, how the Koran got down to us, and the manuscript traditions, what we would call textual criticism, because manuscripts have differences. That's true for the Bible, for the Koran, for Plato. Any ancient document that's been passed down by hand copying, there are going to be differences in the manuscripts because scribes make mistakes. Now, Christians have always known that, always studied it, never been afraid of studying it. And in fact, if you want to study manuscript tradition for the Bible, the best place to go is the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts at Dallas Theological Seminary over in Texas. It's a Christian institute. They're digitizing every manuscript they can get their hands on, and it's done totally in the open. If you want to study the Koran and its transmission and look at textual variants and differences in manuscripts, pretty much no Islamic institution in the world is going to be interested in that one. It's a closed book. And then many Muslims don't even realize they have textual variants. Most Muslims have been taught the Quran has been perfectly preserved. There's no questions, there's no difficulties, there's no issues. And that's simply not true. I would say, the Quran's reasonably reliable as a document we have today, but it's got a history to it, and you've got to do the work, and you've got problems there in the tradition that you need to solve and resolve.
So what about the central question then? Did the Quran drop down from heaven in 114 perfect chapters, all said and done?
Absolutely not. I mean, to go that was into my PhD area. So to bore you now with what my PhD was. So one of the arguments I would come across Muslims using with me when I was in London when I got started, Muslims would say to me, they would say, Andy, look, it's a miracle, right? Because Muhammad was illiterate. Muhammad, the founder of Islam, could neither read nor write, but he, produced the Quran, this amazing work of literature. Whether you believe it or not, it's an amazing work of literature. So there's a miracle, because how could an illiterate man do that? And when you first hear that, that's actually that's not a bad argument. You think that's actually fairly compelling. You've got to, what's going on there? Until you discover that we have many, many works of literature from antiquity. Take, for example, Homer's poems, the great Greek poet Homer and his works, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the foundation of the Western literary tradition, some would say. They come from before writing. We know he can't have used writing; it predates it. Or some of the sort of great mythic traditions in Nordic countries. Look up in Iceland, where you've got the Kalevala, which is it's an amazing cycle of myths and stories. It comes from before writing. So how on earth did people do it? Well, it turns out that people who composed stories, traditions, poetry, religious traditions in those cultures, they had methods they could use to compose their performances, often live in front of an audience. You would stand up in front of the audience and compose and preach, speak, tell your story. And when that eventually gets written down, it leaves its mark on the text. We can actually go and, we can see whether a text or a tradition was composed that way in that kind of culture by signs that are left in the text. And in a nutshell, what my PhD was doing was using computer analysis to show in huge detail that the Quran does not look like a literary product that came direct from heaven. It looks like an oral product that was composed live in front of an audience with all of the limitations that brings. You can show it using computerized analysis in huge detail. So to my Muslim friends, I'd say, the Quran does not look like it came direct from heaven. It has none of those indicators. It looks very much like what you'd expect a 7th century oral, trained, illiterate man to produce.
Right, and you have actually created, you or colleagues have created some kind of tool, online tool, if anyone would be interested in looking at the different textual variants of the Quran.
Absolutely. Well, it doesn't do textual variants. That's the one thing it doesn't do, because that wasn't my area of research. But there is the piece that I did and a couple of colleagues did in related areas, we spun off as a digital tool. So you can go to Quran, 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 spelled that way, hyphen tools, Tools, Quran-tools.com. Sign up for a free account. It's open source, but hosted at Melbourne School of Theology. And what you can do, you can play with my work, you can look at others. You can in particular look at where the Quran has borrowed from other traditions. So something like 25% of the Quran consists of retelling of previous stories, Jewish, Christian, and other traditions. And built into Quran tools, you can, with a few clicks, you can see all of those links, you can read the comparative stuff, you can see what's going on. And you spend an hour there clicking around, you'll begin to go, oh my word, I can see that this is quite a complex area of study, and it doesn't look like it came direct from heaven.
Right. And this is just one of the areas where you could compare the Quran and the Bible. So on this matter, what would your conclusions be about the reliability, about the canonization and the development of the final product of the Quran and the Bible?
Well, yeah. Well, let me say a couple of things very interesting. On the oral piece, what's interesting, we have oral material in the Bible as well. The method that I used on the Koran, it's known as oral formulaic theory, and it's quite an ancient. Well, it's over 100 years old. That school of approach to text. It's been used on the Bible, and in particular, where it works really well is the Psalms, which is what you'd expect, because there's David, with his lyre or whatever, extemporaneously coming out with something to praise. He hasn't sat down carefully composing on Microsoft Word. A lot of that's created live in performance. So actually what's interesting is oral formulaic theory demonstrates that stuff that is supposed to be composed that way is composed that way. Another place you can use orality is the parables of Jesus, because one of the hallmarks of orality is you end up in a text with what's called performance variants. So that's where you have multiple versions of the same story that are slightly different because the storyteller has told them multiple times. And we get this with the parables of Jesus, because you expect that when Jesus had a story like, I don't know, perhaps the Good Samaritan or whatever, he doesn't just tell that story once. Preachers who have a good story tend to reuse their stories. And here's Jesus with a 3-year preaching ministry. You'd expect him to, reuse material. That would be not at all surprising. And therefore, it's not a surprise that material in the Gospels has that oral quality. Now, that's a powerful apologetic. For a long time, hyper-liberal scholars would say, oh, well, lots of the Bible was made up hundreds of years after the events and, by people miles away from the culture. Well, that's odd. It looks actually like it comes from a culture where you've got oral preaching gone in. This looks like it's got the fingerprints of somebody, if not Jesus, very like Jesus. So oral formulaic theory, oral studies, increases our confidence that we're dealing with authentic Jesus material. And the same tool, you apply it to the Quran, it destroys the idea this came direct from heaven. So I love that the area I ended up stumbling into both, increases our confidence in the Bible and questions the Quran. But then on the transmission, very quickly, here's the issue, the big issue for Muslims, is that Christians generally throughout history did a really remarkably good job at preserving their texts. Scribes passed things on. When early church fathers came across manuscripts that had, odd things in them, nobody thought, hey, let's take all the manuscripts together, let's burn them all and keep just one authentic version. Rather, they talked about the differences in the manuscripts. And that means today we have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of manuscripts of the Bible. And that gives us great confidence, because the more data you have, the better you can check. The analogy I sometimes use, or used to use, it no longer works so well because everyone's got mobile phones. But before we all had mobile phones and we relied on watches, it's quite an interesting experiment. If you had 200 people in a room and you called out, okay, what time have people got on their watch? And somebody might say, well, I've got, 3:05. Somebody might say, I've got 3:04. You get a variety of times, right? The more people you've got in that room, the more confident you can be about what the exact time is, because you've got a bigger data set to pull from. And the oddities, like some idiot who's got 6:30, stands right out as clearly wrong. If you only had one person with one watch, they might be right, but you can't check.
Yeah.
With Christians and the Bible, we've got thousands of manuscripts and we can check. The Quran, very quickly to finish the thought, and then you look like a man itching with a question. The Quran, of course, very early after the death of Muhammad, within 20 years.
Precisely, I was checking that. It's not just a myth, it's actually what happened.
Yes. Early, the Uthman, the third caliph of Islam, a couple of decades or even less after Muhammad's death, reports come to him that Muslims up on the battlefield where they're fighting, the Muslim empire is expanding up into Syria. He's brought reports saying to him, we've got a problem here because soldiers are disagreeing and violently disagreeing over what the Quran says. Help us out. And so he tasks Zayd ibn Thabit, that was a man who was Muhammad's secretary, with the task of going and collecting all the different manuscripts or bits of manuscript of the Quran he could find. He then has one authoritative version commissioned, and then the rest are consigned to the flames. And that was controversial back then. There were people who had their own codices who were very resistant at surrendering them. At the time, Uthman was known by some. He was called the destroyer of the book. And Ibn Umar, who was the son of the second caliph, quite an influential figure in early Islam, is reported to have said, "Let no man say he has memorized the entire Quran, for much of what the Quran was has been destroyed. Let him only say he has remembered what there has been preserved of it." Nothing like that happened in early Christianity, which means for Muslims, I can say, you might at best, by careful study of the manuscripts, get back to Uthman, but you can't get behind him, because if he did his work, he did his work too well. And Muslims today, you want to say, well, the Quran's been perfectly preserved. I would say, well, if that were the case, why on earth did the third caliph, the third, really significant leader after Muhammad, why was he going around playing with a box of matches? What was it he saw in those texts that was so devastatingly different? It had to be destroyed. And by the way, if you were to walk out into the middle of Stockholm today and set fire to a Quran, you'd be, potentially arrested for incitement to hatred. You'd have your life would be at risk. There'd be, Muslims coming after you. And I say, well, actually, the first person to burn Quran manuscripts was not some right-wing, political agitator. Not saying you are, by the way. It was, the leader of the Muslim community who thought the problems in the Quran are so serious, the only solution was the flames.
Yeah, and that's just one of the areas where we can compare the Bible and the Quran. When we go to, for instance, geography, the understanding of geography that you're actually writing about, what are the differences between the New Testament and the Quran there?
Well, here's a really good question you asked. So one of the things that, is important for us as Christians, right, is that when we're dealing with the Gospels in particular, that we know that we're dealing with first-hand eyewitness testimony, right? Here are four, first century documents that claim to give us information about Jesus. Well, how do we know they're accurate? We want to know we're dealing with eyewitness accounts. And one of the studies that's really grown in popularity and seriousness in the last 20, 25 years has been real emphasis on looking for the evidence of eyewitness testimony in the Gospels. In fact, it was a groundbreaking book published, I think, in 2003, 2004, by a British New Testament scholar called Richard Borkham, called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which showed in sometimes like eye-wateringly minute detail the level of information there. Now, one area you can look at to show whether somebody is an eyewitness, Per, is you can look at when they talk about geography. So if you heard me saying, I know the Nordic countries very well, I've been to Oslo many times, I love feeding the tame penguins that roam the middle of the city and climbing the mountain in the middle of it and so on. And you look more and more incredulous going, mate, I know Oslo. I may be Swedish, but I do occasionally go across the border and to go.
And actually, I think you mentioned a factual mistake about Nordic literature, but I didn't correct you because it just emphasizes that you're a foreigner here. So never mind that.
Yes, exactly. So point being, my mistake gives me away that I'm a foreigner, right? On the other hand, if you heard me talk about London, I grew up there, I lived in London for 30 years, I can give you the kind of detail, the fine kind of detail that, well, at the very least, I've either talked to eyewitnesses or I've obviously been there because I know things. I can literally describe where a mailbox is on a particular street corner, and to go, well, that's ridiculous. Maybe Google Maps these days, but there we are. Now, here's the thing: the Gospels get that level of fine detail right. There are dozens of place names mentioned in the Gospels, not just the big places like Jerusalem, but tiny one-camel towns like Cana and Nazareth. The Gospels know which places are on the coast, which places are on the lakeside, which are in the mountains. They know how long it takes to travel between places. They know agriculture patterns. They know, all kinds of detail that you either have to go, either Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, I don't know what they did, quite frankly, because it was before Wikipedia. The only possible conceivable answer to this is that they talked to people who were there or lived there. And by the way, they mention place names a lot. There's a lot of place names turn up in the Gospels. There's detail in there. So these are documents grounded in geography. We turn now to the Koran, particularly when it talks about Jesus. When it talks about Jesus, we have nothing. It's just geographically floating free. You could relocate it entirely. The Quran doesn't know where he was born, when he was born. So you either have to assume the writer of the Quran, being God, if you're a Muslim, knew all this but couldn't be bothered to stick it in there. Or you conclude whoever wrote the Quran knew nothing. He knew some stories about Jesus, but didn't know where they took place. And chronologically, by the way, it's been observed, if you read the Quran and only the Quran, you would assume that Jesus and Moses were contemporaries. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is called the sister of Aaron because it looks like the Quran confuses Maryam, which is Mary in Arabic, with Miriam, which is obviously Miriam. And then furthermore, you widen the lens, the Quran contains hardly any place names. Arguably, Mecca's not mentioned. There's one reference that could be Mecca, but it's a bit controversial. And then what's even more interesting is the place names that are mentioned are not down in Arabia where Muhammad's career is supposed to begin. They're all up in Syria, they're up in the north. So it's really weird. It looks like A, the Quran doesn't know what it's talking about, and B, the things that are talking about is in the wrong place. So again, it's another sign that the Quran is not from where it's supposed to be, not from when it's supposed to be, written by someone who didn't know what he was talking about. Muhammad, if we credit Muhammad with the writing of the whole of the Quran, just didn't really know what he was talking about. He was dealing with stories he'd heard secondhand in the marketplace orally, and then repackaging those as he preached what became Islam.
And we could just add one other area in combination to this, that is archaeology. How do the archaeological evidence for the Quran compare to the archaeological evidence for the New Testament?
Yeah. Well, there's an amazing question that's right on the edge of my area, but, like all apologists, we're happy to, waffle on. Let's start with biblical archaeology. I mean, biblical archaeology is amazing, right? There are journals, there are conferences, a whole rich field. If you want to, you can, if you're into archaeology, you can go out and volunteer and head out to Israel or Jordan, by the way, lots of biblical sites in Jordan. And you can get involved in biblical archaeology. Stuff described in the Bible, comes out of the ground. And often, so the archaeology proves the Bible, but it adds color, it adds detail, and it corroborates the stories. There's a famous episode in John's Gospel, the Pool of Siloam, I think that it was. For many years, skeptics thought that story was made up because they never found it. Well, then it turned up the ground 50 years ago. There's lots of those kind of things happen where stuff that we dig out of the ground makes the Bible look like it's, again, a story rooted there in history. The Quran is interesting because if you take the Quran at face value, if you take Islamic history at first value, we've got to be careful here. Muslims, if you ask Muslims, where did Islam begin? Well, ask non-Muslims, where did Islam begin? They'll say Mecca. That's where Muhammad, operated his career. Okay, tell me about Mecca. Well, it was this famous trading center. Lots of trading routes converged there. You had the Kaaba, that great cube-shaped building toward which Muslims pray. It was this massive center of worship. Okay, fantastic. All right. And if you read the early, Islamic traditions, the so-called Hadith traditions, Mecca was supposed to be this center of agriculture and civilization and so on. Okay, now things get interesting. The limited archaeology that's been done in where Mecca is today, none of that is corroborated. So those traditions say that, that Mecca had agriculture and vineyards. Well, there's no history anywhere that comes out of the ground of that going on in Mecca. It's a dust bowl. The trade routes are interesting. There's died a few years ago now, but a very well-regarded critical scholar of Islam called Patricia Crona, who for years was at Princeton University in the USA. She wrote a groundbreaking book in, I think, the late 1990s called Meccan Trade. And she just asked the question, okay, we're told that Mecca was on the trading routes and was a center of trade. Has anyone actually gone and looked? And she went and looked at the evidence of the trade routes because there is, there are archives and records and people have written this stuff up. Turns out Mecca does not appear to have been on a major trade route. The major trade routes went inland along the high ground, or by the period of time that Islam was beginning, things are being traded by sea. It was much cheaper to send things by sea than lug them overland, particularly through somewhere like Mecca that didn't have a reliable water supply. And so her conclusion is it's made up. It's all redacted back. A lot of the early history of Islam, there is no evidence on the ground to support it. So it turns out when we look at the texts themselves don't measure up to what Muslims say. We look internally, at the wider Islamic traditions, the Hadith and so on, and again, it casts huge questions. Then we start digging on the ground or looking at other ancient sources. Mecca doesn't turn up on a map until way too late. It just builds this picture that I would not go so far as, some people have gone so far as say, well, Muhammad never existed, it's all a myth. I think that's too far. You need something around which Islam coalesces, right? In the same way that to make a pearl, the oyster needs a bit of grit stuck in it. You need something to start Islam, but I think it was far smaller and far shakier than Muslims today have been told. And what later happens is this great hagiography, great collection of myths and legends and stories grew up around the beginning. And those layers are now so thick, we can't get through them to the beginning. So, for Christianity, we can talk about historical Jesus. You can do good historical work on early Christianity without being a Christian, and there's lots of resources there. If you want to do really good critical work on early Islam, unless you're committed because you're a Muslim, I think you have to throw your hands up and go, we just don't know, because we haven't got the data.
This is very interesting comparison in itself, but I'm thinking a follow-up question is, we would expect to hear a huge and vivid discussion about this in popular debate, in academic debate, but I don't hear these discussions and these comparisons between the Bible and the Quran. Why would you say that we don't hear that as often as we should?
Whole series of reasons. Within the church, we've neglected Islam for a long time. I think it's been seen as a niche thing. I remember back in the, sort of 2006 when the God Delusion came out, Richard Dawkins and the New Atheism, huge amounts of noise. The church talked about it a lot. There were apologetics conferences, on and on it went. And I remember looking at it going, okay, this is important, but I think Islam is the bigger challenge. But nobody was taking it seriously. So I think within the church, we've been very slow to wake up to the fact that we need to engage Islam. I mean, you would know more than I would the statistics for the number of Muslims you've got in Sweden and what that number might hit. I mean, I think I said at the conference in Stockholm, the average number they're projecting by 2050, you'll be 25% Muslim. The high number is you'll be 33% Muslim by 2050. That's not there's a whole other discussion around immigration. That's not, related to this. But other than to say, for Christians, we need to engage Muslims properly, and we haven't, first thing. Secondly, Muslims, of course, have had no interest in doing it. They just closed the door on it. Really, in Islam, it is really fideism. You believe because you believe because you believe. You're not encouraged to ask these kinds of questions. And one reason, by the way, I think for many Muslims increasingly now coming to faith, we're seeing more Muslims come to faith, in recent years than for a long time, has been with the advent of the internet. These questions can't be avoided. You can't run away from them. Well, I've had former Muslim friends who are now Christians who what happened was they started asking questions. They did an internet search and discovered, oh, my word, there's all this stuff going on. But then the bigger one in the culture, I think secular culture, I don't know how it's in Sweden. Here in the UK, I think our political class, our universities are terrified of, Islamism, not Islam. The majority of Muslims are, they believe passionately, but they're not violent. But you've got enough who are. You've got a big enough, Islamism strand, the Muslim Brotherhood and movements descended from that to go, it's just too much trouble. You're going to get death threats. You're going to get huge problems. And also here in the UK, you're seeing, as Muslims start voting en masse and clumping together. If you're a politician, are you going to stand up and ask questions knowing that you'll be unelected in the next election because 25% of your electorate are now Muslims? So it shuts discussion down. And then the last piece would be funding. To go, all of the Gulf states in particular have been very smart where they've sent money. And so to go, if you're a university and you're on the receiving end of a very large endowment from the Saudi Arabian government, not related to Islam, perhaps they're funding something in technology or engineering, but it's just mentioned that if you happen to be thinking of doing anything around Islamic origins, just be aware. There's $10 million on the hook here. And by the way, again, I always be scrupulously fair. They're not the only ones doing this. The Chinese have been doing this for years too, with Confucius centers around the world, funding, sort of pro-China kind of interest in our universities, making it very hard for academics to ask questions. Such that on Islam, if you wanted to go and do a PhD, like mine, in a secular university in the UK, be very, very hard to find. A very few universities will do it. That's one reason I did mine in a Christian theological institute. Yes, it was a theological institute validated by a mainstream university. So my degree is from a mainstream university. But if I just wandered up to my local university, to Oxford University, and gone, hey, I want to do a PhD, spending 7 years deconstructing the Quran, I think I'd have been given a nice cup of tea and shown the door. We don't ask those kind of questions. It causes too much trouble.
But if we want to take on the challenge, then now you've spoken as an academic, an Islamic scholar, and as a Christian apologist. How do we take on the challenge as Christians to communicate the biblical message about Jesus to Muslims? A general piece of advice.
What an amazing question. So many things I could say, but first thing, we need to start praying. I think our churches need to start waking up to the fact there's a challenge here. And if we start praying into things, God changes hearts. So I've been encouraging church leaders, start by praying regularly for your Muslim friends. And there's great resources out there to help you, like every Ramadan. Quite a lot of Christian mission agencies produce prayer guides to encourage you to be praying for the gospel to Muslims, whether it's in Sweden, the UK, or globally. Start praying. Secondly, particularly with our young people, you've got younger people, students, young adults in your congregations who are going to have many more Muslim friends at their workplaces, their universities. As churches, we can be saying, okay, let's start putting some training in. Let's be putting some seminars on. Let's be bringing people like me and others. You've got Stefan over there in Sweden. He's not a Muslim specialist, but he's brilliant at a whole range of things. To go, let's start training people up. And then the top of it would be, two other things quickly. Let's be praying for and encouraging young Christian women and men who want to go the scholarship route. Let's not, with our brightest and best, say, we'll go to seminary and, study homiletics and learn to be a preacher. We need preachers, but hey, you've got a passion for reaching Muslims. Let's encourage you and fund you and support you to go to the best universities, to learn the good stuff, to do the research, and then so we can be equipping the church to do that. And then lastly, let's be really praying for and supporting the Muslims who come to Christ and come to our churches. Some of the most effective critics of Islam I know are former Muslims. I had a friend some years ago called Nabil Qureshi. Sadly, we lost Nabil to cancer, but he was an incredible communicator to Muslims because he'd been a Muslim. There's a woman called Hatun Tash, a Turkish lady, former Muslim, who preaches in London at Speaker's Corner. Hatun is amazing. She just is so good at deconstructing Islam because she knows it inside out. We have more and more of these people coming through. Let's support them, encourage them, disciple them, and then go, okay, let's help you to reach your former, Muslim friends, because former Muslims often make the best witnesses to Muslims.
This is great advice. Thank you so much for sharing both insight and inspiration, Andy. Thanks for appearing at the Bible Podcast.
It's been a joy and a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Ja, men då kopplar vi tillbaka till studion här, från en gäst i England till samma gäst i Göteborg. Ja, det här var ju en genomgång då av hur Bibeln står sig så fantastiskt i kontrast till Koranen. Har du någonting du kan lägga till utifrån det vi sa i början, Jonas, om hur de olika skrifterna är?
Ja, men man kan ju se att Bibeln på något sätt är förankrad i vår historia, och det förunderliga är ju att det finns en röd tråd genom Bibeln som går från första Mosebok till uppenbarelseboken och som sträcker sig över mer än 2000 år av historia, och ändå finns det en enhet. Va? Koranen har ju inte alls den styrkan som bok, utan där är ju surerna efter sina längder sorterade. Vi ska vara väldigt tacksamma över att Gud har gjort avtryck i historien, tycker jag.
Ja, och det är ju en sak som gör att Bibeln är mycket mer läsvänlig än vad Koranen är, som hoppar fram och tillbaka kronologiskt och ibland till den faktiska historien och ibland till andra typer av texter. Så precis, jag håller med dig. Vi ska vara väldigt tacksamma att Bibeln är ordnad som den är. Det här programmet, BibelPodden, vill vi ha som en resurs till alla som vill fördjupa sig och lära mer om Bibeln. Och vi kan hjälpas åt att sprida det här programmet vidare. Dels kan du göra det genom att dela det och gilla det och prenumerera på de olika kanaler där det sänds. Men du kan också hjälpa oss genom att ge till det här projektet så att vi kan fortsätta att göra de här programmen och sprida dem fritt till så många som möjligt. Och då kommer det information här nedanför. Så kan du på olika sätt vara med och bidra och hjälpa till så att vi kan sända det här programmet så att Guds ord kan få gå ut till många i Sverige. Och då kan vi skicka med en liten pålysning till nästa program. För att i nästa program ska vi gå till allra första delen av Bibeln, nämligen skapelseberättelsen. Och då ska vi träffa Tore Jungerstam som har skrivit en bok om detta som vi har gett ut i Klapphamninstitutet. Så att då möts vi igen. Då får du ha det bra så där borta i Göteborg och fortsätta med ditt arbete, Jonas, så länge.
Detsamma till er i Stockaryd.
Och tack och välkommen åter nästa vecka till ett nytt avsnitt av Bibelpodden.